Well, hello everybody. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. I'm going to take a little bit of a step out here and make a statement, and that statement is that there are differences between the male and the female brain. That is a biological fact, and it's something actually we should celebrate, as did Dr. Sara Gottfried, who is our guest today on the Empowering Neurologist. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Gottfried. She is a Harvard-educated physician, an author, a speaker. As a matter of fact, she has already written 3 New York Times bestsellers, and likely her new book, which is Brain Body Diet, 40 Days to a Lean, Calm, Energized, and Happy Self, I'm certain will be a New York Times bestseller as well. For the past 20 years, Dr. Gottfried has been dedicated to women, helping women feel more at home in their bodies. She graduated as a physician scientist from the Harvard School of Medicine / MIT program that really was fairly unique in cultivating this type of an individual, a physician scientist. She completed her residency at the University of California in San Francisco and is board certified in obstetrics and gynecology. She is an integrative gynecologist, meaning that she practices personal lifestyle medicine looking at the individual. She is a firm believer in not just treating symptoms of disease, but really identifying and addressing the root cause of problems, again, not just focusing on symptoms. She believes that leafy greens are an important part of our diets, that the diet should really look at the value of plants and also the nutrient density of foods. She also looks at evidence-based research in terms of the integration of various botanical products into her practice. And really, as you're about to see in our interview, looks at the whole notion of integrating various aspects of that are important, body, mind, and spirit, into creating a you that can really participate in life. Let me read you a couple of her quotes. She states that her mission is to help women feel sexy, vital, and balanced from their cells to their soul. One other quote, "I believe that managing and optimizing your health is your divine responsibility and path to personal power." Here is her new book, Brain Body Diet. Really talks about the connection between what goes on in the brain, the differences in the woman's brain compared to a man's brain. And it's a fascinating read. I actually had the opportunity to write the foreword to this book that you will find on drperlmutter.com. So, without further ado, let's say hello to Dr. Sara Gottfried. Hello, Dr. Gottfried. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. So happy to be here with you.
The book is called The Brain Body Diet. What is this connection to the brain?
Well, you're a neurologist, so I feel like I've got an excellent audience here. You know, what I realized was that in my work over the past 25 years, I've really focused on women, what goes wrong with us, what goes right with us. I focused on hormones. That was kind of my initial portal to women's health. But I also realized in my 40s, as someone who had optimized my hormones and had done that for thousands of patients, that it was incomplete. And it took an event in my life that happened in 2015 to really bring in the importance of the brain. Now, I had read your books, Dr. Perlmutter, so I had a sense of how important the brain was, but this is often how things come home for us as individuals, that you have a sudden event in your life or you have a scary diagnosis, and that starts to kind of bring into relief a different way of thinking about the body. So what I realized in 2015 when I fell to the ground and hit my head very hard, I had traumatic brain injury, that I didn't understand these conversations that happen between the body and the brain. I knew the hormonal part of the conversation, but I didn't know the bigger picture. So what I mean by brain body is this really important bidirectional conversation that's happening all the time between the various parts of your body, especially your gut, in your brain, and then from the brain to the rest of your body, especially the healing messages.
You know, interestingly, I came to it from just the opposite perspective, that, you know, as a neurologist, we looked at the brain and didn't pay any attention to the rest of the body, didn't think in our wildest imagination that bacteria in the gut could influence what's going on in this segregated area of the brain, you know, this so reductionist Cartesian mentality that the brain exists in and of itself and doesn't interact. And as a gynecologist, to come to this revelation, it's almost like getting bumped on the head to really make you realize it. It's exactly what happened. So I want our viewers to know that this is an excellent, it's just a wonderful book. And I also want to just be very open about the fact that we got to spend some time together in New York last week, where you had you were participating, filmed for our upcoming Alzheimer's prevention movie, or call it a documentary, and you just did such an amazing job. So I'm on the air. I'm going to thank you for that yet again. So what is it then, and as I mentioned in the introduction, that it is politically correct, I believe, it's absolutely correct to recognize that men's and women's brains are different from each other. And we should celebrate that, number one. And number two, it does sort of form a platform for us to begin to understand why it is that women are more likely to get certain issues like anxiety, depression, and certainly Alzheimer's disease, while on the other hand, less likely to be diagnosed with things like autism, Tourette's syndrome. Why might that be?
Well, this is such a great question. And I like that you started with the political correctness of this question, because in the past, certainly when I went through my medical training and even through college, the question of the female brain versus the male brain was really set up as who's better? Who's better at doing math? Who's better at reading maps? Who's better at emotional regulation? Who's better at stress management? And that's not the frame that I want to use today. I want to use this larger frame that I think you're speaking to, which is, how do we understand these differences, of which there are many, at a structural, a molecular, and a functional level? How do we apply those to our broadening concept of health and wellness? Because I think our definition of health, and certainly our quantification of health, has changed dramatically over the past 25 plus years since I graduated from medical school. So to take your question about how are they different, I'll hit a few highlights, and I hope you'll riff with me, because I think as a neurologist,
I love to riff.
I know you love to riff.
For anyone who knows, I just bought a loop pedal, and some of our listeners will know what a loop pedal is, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, hopefully you'll tell me what that is.
I'll tell you real quick. A loop pedal allows you to lay down a track on your guitar and then play it back and play riff with yourself. So anyway, go ahead.
Oh, this is good. Yeah, I see on your Instagram, you with your guitar, which gets me super excited. I know that's one of the ways that you manage cortisol, which hopefully we'll get to later. So there's all of these differences. There's what are known as sex differences, which are the biological differences. And you and I were talking about those, I think, last Saturday. Things like sex hormones, differences in estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, as well as others. There's differences either directly or indirectly in neurotransmitters, many of which are related to hormonal differences. There's structural differences. So for instance, if you look at a male versus female brain on imaging, you can tell with about 85% certainty that one is female, one is male. So it's not 100%, but in general, we know that women tend to have a bigger hippocampus, at least up until a certain age, and men tend to have a larger cerebellum, which is responsible for movement and coordination and other things. So these things kind of make intuitive sense. There's also gender differences. So we know that with the way our culture has evolved, that women tend to have more caretaking. They tend to have more responsibilities for children and for aging parents, etc. We take care of husbands, not always in an egalitarian way. We've got the wage gap. We've got lots of socioeconomic cultural differences in terms of how we are raised. So there's the gender and the sex differences. And then these seem to map onto some of the clinical conditions that you and I learned so much about when we went through our medical training, and now kind of think about in a different way. Things like anxiety, things like depression. We know that the rate of depression, the rate of insomnia, the rate of Alzheimer's disease is about double in women compared to men. And what I see clinically, I'm curious if this is something you see as well, I see those differences really start to come to be dramatic in perimenopause. So that's when I start to see this divergence, and I start to see the higher rates of anxiety, changes in the female brain, changes in the female brain body. And so I think it's probably related especially to sex hormone differences, but let me put this back on you, because I think you've got some other ways of thinking about the difference between the male and female brain.
Well, I've been creating a manuscript for the next book that I have coming out with our son Austin Perlmutter, an internal medicine physician, and it deals with reconnecting to the prefrontal cortex, and that's a part of the brain that seems to be involved in future planning, compassion, empathy, understanding the feelings of another, as opposed to another area of the brain called the amygdala, which is much more involved in impulsivity, instant reaction to an event, and does help us process fearful experiences. And, in talking with you last week and talking with you now, I've really come to realize, and I mentioned this actually in the talk that I gave in New York, that the prefrontal cortex is, attributed now with those feminine characteristics that you just brought up. And that what we're talking about in the book is that our modern life experiences are conspiring to distance us from connecting to that important part of the brain, be it called the female brain, the feminine part of the brain, or revert to the anatomical definition. But the inadequate sleep that we receive through upregulating cortisol and being an inflammatory event, increasing insulin resistance, the inflammatory nature of our foods, the inflammatory nature of what we are experiencing on digital media, on social media, the targeting of us to make us think that we are less worthy and that there's an instant click to satisfy that sense of worthlessness. All of these things are working to distance us from tapping into that part of the brain that we need for ourselves, that I need to be a better person as I relate to you, and that we all need in order to better relate to the health of the planet. So that's what's going through my mind right now in our conversation, if you must know. And it really, what we've discovered as we've created this manuscript is what we've uncovered ultimately becomes an existential conversation, that the future of our world in terms of us getting along with other nations, people who are different from us, really depends on us getting into that prefrontal cortex and gaining a degree of understanding and empathy that we're moving away from these days based upon the other influences I mentioned.
Well, I love this, and I can't wait for your book to come out. I also want to honor the way that you are, you've tended your son for many years. He is launching his medical career, and I just think it's amazing that you're doing this work together.
Well, the book is about connecting, and what a part of the narrative that I get to connect with somebody in that generation, and who, to share in cross-generation fashion our ideas, and then ultimately appeal to his generation via his input and how he sees the world. But that said, it causes me to really, really value you and your work. And, truthfully, whenever I do these podcasts, I have a whole script in front of me of the questions I want to ask, but we're taking this to an unscripted part of our time together. And
yes.
I realized after watching your interview for the upcoming Alzheimer's prevention, documentary how important this messaging is with respect to women / the female brain, and how valuable your participation really is because of that part that you're adding to the whole story. So again, thank you for that.
I appreciate that. I want to make sure we're honoring all the other people who stand with me, including you, David, because there's no single individual, I think, who has really mastered some of these concepts. What you were just talking about with the prefrontal cortex is super interesting to me. You know, I think of the prefrontal cortex in my more simplistic gynecology understanding as the place of resourcefulness. And, I think about some of the imaging data again and the differences between the male and the female brain. And I know that on average, men tend to have a larger amygdala. And I think of the amygdala, the first thing I think of is my husband, who is a lifelong athlete. I'm more of a mathlete than an athlete, but if you throw any object at my husband, he will catch it. Like, it doesn't matter how fast it's thrown at him. He has that kind of rapid assessment of his environment, whether it's threat or a sharp object or a ball, a football, any kind of ball, he will catch it. If you throw a ball at me or any sort of object, half the time it's going to hit me because I'm thinking about other things. I'm distracted.
If it hits you in the head, that'll be inspiration for a new book.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to not get another traumatic head injury. But just to point out kind of this difference, again, between the male and the female brain. And what's so cool is that there's this opportunity to develop that resourcefulness. And it sounds like your book is all about that particular concept.
Right. So we are going to leverage the notion of neuroplasticity, that we can rewire our brains away from being directly involved in fear, seeing the world as being threatening, to reconnect with the prefrontal cortex. One of the individuals we interviewed on the same day we interviewed you was Dr. Michael Merzenich, who has been called the father of neuroplasticity, who flew from San Francisco to New York to participate. It was very heartwarming, and it was, again, a terrific honor to be speaking to an individual like that who wants to be part of what we're doing because it's so important. Let's talk about this issue. Why don't we talk about Alzheimer's? And let's talk about in the context of it being primarily a woman's situation.
Yes, well, I know you also interviewed Lisa Mosconi last week, and I think her work is so interesting, and I feel like it really matches up with the experience that I've had taking care of women for the past 25 years. And let me explain that. So, as you know, David, she's at Cornell. She's done this really interesting work imaging female brains. And she looks at 3 different time periods. She looks at premenopause. So this is women up until about age 35. She looks at perimenopause, which on average lasts for women for 2 to 8 years, typically between 35 and 51. And then she looks at postmenopause, so over the age of 51. And what she's found is that women starting in perimenopause have these changes in the brain that predate the diagnosis of Alzheimer's by 25 plus years. Now, much of your work is about, okay, what can we do to prevent that arc to Alzheimer's disease? And what I think is so interesting about her work is that she's seen these changes. I think of it as kind of a slowdown in metabolism of the brain. She calls it cerebral hypometabolism, meaning that glucose just isn't taken up in the same way. There are certain areas that start to get more quiet as women go through their 40s, through perimenopause. We know that estrogen is the master regulator of the female body, and certainly estrogen levels initially wildly fluctuate in perimenopause and then start to decline and are lower postmenopause. So we think estrogen probably has something to do with it, although we don't have definitive proof. And what I think is exciting is that she's also found that 20% of women in perimenopause have no change at all. They look more like men who have no change through the same time period. So I get really curious about the 20%. And then also my heart goes out to these other women who are starting to have these cerebral hypometabolism changes, slowdown of metabolism. And I think about what can we do? What can we do with the way that they are eating, moving, thinking, connecting, supplementing to try to prevent that arc that leads eventually to early cognitive decline and potentially dementia?
Well, if you look at those images that oddly enough appeared last week in the Wall Street Journal, they did actually a report based upon Lisa Mosconi's research and showed those three images. So if we can get licensing to do that, we'll get those images posted. And it does show on PET scanning that demonstrates glucose or sugar utilization in areas of the brain that are the signature regions for Alzheimer's, a decline in women around menopause and postmenopause. Interestingly, though, the work of Dr. Stephen Cunnane, who is a Canadian researcher, I got to sit on a panel with him at a metabolic conference about 3 or 4 weeks ago. His work looks at brain metabolism using a radioactive C11 acetoacetate, which is a marker for the utilization of ketones. And what he has demonstrated is in individuals who do show those glucose hypometabolism or bioenergetic deficits, which we used to think was an indication of neuronal failure, that the reason the brain shows these deficits in glucose utilization is because the neurons were dying. Well, it turns out that's not true at all, that when ketones are supplied and you image the brain, it lights up in a very normal way. And that ketone utilization is preserved even in early to mild, mid-stage Alzheimer's disease. So I'm not sure if it was a rhetorical question, but I would say that that applying this knowledge to a woman whose brain scan demonstrates these hypometabolism areas that you talk about, applying the knowledge would tell us that a ketogenic diet by supplying ketones could repower the brain. And we've absolutely observed this clinically, that when people, not just women, but when people have early stage Alzheimer's and demonstrate abnormalities on these scans, that they can absolutely come back online when powering their brains with an alternative fuel source, being ketones. So, you know, there's a huge interest in the ketogenic diet. It was the #1 health-related search term on Google for 2018, and with good reason. You know, we're all familiar with so many things that the ketogenic diet does. The brain is a huge beneficiary of that science, and so we're doing our very best to leverage that, recognizing that ketogenic diet also enhances reconnection in the brain and repopulating the brain with new brain cells. Who knew? You know, you and I were not given that
No.
information in medical school, or if we were, we weren't there that day. So,
So can I ask, I'm curious about Stephen Cunnane's work, which I haven't looked at, so if you could educate me a little bit.
I'll send you that information.
I would love to see it. Did he looked at both men and women, and he looked over the same time course of premenopause,
yes,
perimenopause, and postmenopause?
He looks at, he contextualizes this energetic deficit much more broadly, demonstrating that these deficits early on, that, as you indicated, presage to the diagnosis, the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's by 2 to 3 decades, which is pretty remarkable, in several other groups. And they include individuals who have a maternal diagnosis. The mother had Alzheimer's disease, carriers of the APOE4 allele, and also, importantly, women diagnosed with PCOS who have anywhere from a 10 to 14% decline in their cerebral utilization of glucose. Now, what does that say to us in terms of trying to understand the 2-to-1 ratio in terms of Alzheimer's women to men? In our current society, where we're seeing, you know, virtually an explosion of PCOS, which obviously needs to be renamed, because we even see it in men for that matter. But it's indicative of it not being an inherited issue, but it's an environmental issue. It's related to things to which women are exposed and their lifestyle choices, which is what your book is all about. So I think there's yet another explanation there that deserves being vetted, that relates this energy deficit, more common in women, seen in pre and perimenopause and postmenopause for sure, that needs to enter into the conversation. What is the role basically of insulin resistance that typifies 80% of women with PCOS have insulin resistance and are put on metformin for that reason and others, along with their obesity. So what is it that is this relationship? And if insulin is so important for the energetics of the brain, then I think that's important information. And beyond that, insulin functionality is important for the utilization of ketones, for the creation and utilization of ketones. So becoming insulin resistant cuts off both opportunities for fueling the brain, and that is a lifestyle choice. Another wonderful Sara in my life is Sara Hallberg at
Yes.
Health, and
Yes.
the two most important Saras in my life, you and Sara Hallberg.
I'm honored.
And the Hall & Oates song, which I think is great. But look what she did. You know, in a one-year study, was able to show restoration of insulin sensitivity, reduction of medication, discontinuing sulfonylureas in the entire group, interventional group. So it is there. It's knowledge, and it's so unfortunate that here in Western cultures, we live by the notion of just do whatever you want, we'll fix it with a pill. And
that
this gets back to your book. We got to talk about your wonderful book.
I have to mention a couple of things that you just went through, which I think are crucial to this conversation. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. You know, I was taught that it affects about 10% of women, and yet what I found in practice was that it was more like a third of my patients. And I'm sure that many of the women that were in the Virta study with Sara Hallberg also have polycystic ovarian syndrome, and I agree the name is terrible. We know that women with PCOS have an altered microbiome. We know the gut-brain axis is not normal. We also know that women with polycystic ovarian syndrome have an issue not only, certainly with the control system for their hormones, with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal thyroid gonadal axis. They have a level of stress resilience that's lower than the normal healthy patient. And I mention this because I learned another thing from Lisa Mosconi last week. She shared with me some data from October 2018 from the University of Texas. I'm sure you probably saw this data too, showing that in midlife, so starting in your 40s, in both men and women, stress has major effects on brain structure and function. So we know that women are more vulnerable than men. We know that high levels of stress, so if you take the people who have kind of the top third in terms of cortisol, the main hormone of stress, they have shrinkage of the brain. And I haven't seen a lot of data on that in women in their 40s. So I think this is really important. So it affects the structure of the brain. It reduces the volume of the brain. And it also is associated with reduced memory and visual perception. So I just wanted to talk about that for a moment too, because I feel like stress in many ways is the elephant in the room. It's a thing that we talk about and people, they just sort of are a nerd to it, like their eyes glaze over when we talk about stress. And I want people to care about stress because there's such a biological cost to not paying attention to it, to having a high level of perceived stress. We know it shrinks the telomeres. We know it accelerates the aging process. We know it either causes or exacerbates 90% of disease, if not more. We know it pokes holes in the gut lining. So I feel like stress is also such an important part of the conversation here.
Well, without a doubt. I mean, we can go back 15 years to the work of Robert Sapolsky and looking at primates who were exposed to stress, and subordinate primates versus the dominant males and their level of stress. And, from that, we learned that, yes, it is directly toxic to the hippocampus, but at very low levels, cortisol actually is a virtual requirement for encoding memory. So it is about some is good, more is not necessarily better. Obviously, in this case, it's much worse. And I think by and large, you would agree that cortisol regulation in women is less salubrious than it is in men. But the point is, as you bring out in your book, you can do something about that. I mean, you talk about exercise and yoga and the value of sleep. You talk about the importance of connection, and you said to me the other day And I wrote it down, tend and befriend. I mean, and you said that women should have a female friend to do things with, and men should have a female friend to do things with. And there's huge value in that. I mean, if we're talking about being in the presence of an individual who's more connected to those things, this empathy and compassion and future planning, I'm all in. And that's what tending and befriending. Tending is your outreach. Befriending is giving that person of your soul. And so those are all important components of reducing stress. And I think the biggest issue, I don't know if it's an elephant in the room, but maybe it's a rhinoceros, is the lack of understanding and appreciation of the value of sleep. We still, believe that if you want to get the job done and be successful, you need to, remember, burn the midnight oil, because then you can get ahead and you can gain an advantage over your competitor, whatever your goal may be. And yet, truthfully, with restorative sleep, you do gain an advantage if that's your goal, because you're going to function so much better. And you and I both in our training and in practice were directly experiencing what sleep deficit did in terms of our functionality moment to moment. But it's important people recognize there are long-term consequences here as it relates to the mechanism you brought up, i.e. elevated cortisol, the damaging effects that has on your precious memory center. But the good news is, that's the area of the brain, the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, that regenerates. Who knew that? And then what we can do. We engage in these activities. We get restorative sleep. We exercise. We eat a lower sugar, lower refined carbohydrate diet to emphasize the production of ketones to enhance brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We get a second chance. So, these concepts that you bring forth and that we write about, there's such a pushback from mainstream medicine who doesn't want to look at this inconvenient truth that drugs for Alzheimer's do not exist, as you and I have this conversation right now. So,
that's right.
And that I want to tell our viewers, that's the information in your book. It says 40 days to a lean, calm, energized, and happy self, but the richness that you put forth about what goes on upstairs and how we can change that, it's well beyond a book for women. I just want everybody to know that.
Thank you. Well, I love that you brought up sleep, because I feel like out of all the lifestyle factors, sleep may be as close to a panacea as we have. And I use that word very carefully. And I imagine when you and I went through our residency training, I was working, probably about 110 hours per week, something like that. I was taught that if you got 3.5 hours of sleep, that you could do surgery the next day, that your manual dexterity was just fine. And it turns out, of course, in the intervening 25 plus years, that that's not the case. There are so many, when you disrupt the circadian rhythm in that way, you disrupt every hormone. Cortisol's higher, you're going to crave sugar more the next day. It causes so many issues in terms of the brain-body connection. And we also know that only about 3% of the population does well with less than 7 hours of sleep. So the goal here is about 7 to 8.5 hours of sleep. More, again, is not necessarily better. I really encourage the folks who work with me to wear some sort of tracker. We know it's not as good as a sleep study, but a sleep study is also quite artificial. But I use an Oura ring. I have a lot of different techniques that I use. I also have an Apple Watch and a few other ways to track sleep. And I like to look at heart rate variability. I like to look at my deep sleep and my REM sleep, as well as the total sleep. And I think when we get into the details, we know that what you measure improves. And so I really want to encourage our listeners and viewers to start tracking some of these metrics that we're talking about, because they really add up to a change.
The Oura Ring is really very simple. This morning, I actually interviewed the founder of that company, why he created it, what they found, who he's interacting with now at major institutions, and the robust data that they've been able to harvest from the ring that downloads into your smartphone. So I think it's, we live in an age where we have access to this biohacking opportunities that can really give us great information. I've written quite a bit about the notion that, you say you slept 8 hours last night. Okay. Did you really sleep well during those 8 hours? Well, how would you know? Well, you'd only know if you underwent a sleep study. And now we have this incredible technology that you're talking about. The Oura Ring is one example. So I think it's good for people to look at that. I mean, might you have self-arousal? Might you have sleep apnea, periodic leg movements? Who knows? Might your partner be almost awakening, but you didn't quite remember it? You just don't know. It's worth pursuing. You touched upon a little while ago, you mentioned the microbiome, and you talk about that in your book. How does that relate to the brain?
Oh, I think the connections are far and deep. You've written quite a bit about this, so I hope we once again can riff on this. One of the things that I realized with the microbiome is that there's a lot that we know, but in many ways, I think we're at the beginning stages. I just went to a 3-day conference at the University of California in San Diego with Rob Knight and his group, and it's just amazing to me the big data, the volume of data that we have. And in terms of how those translate into clinical insights, I think we're still in our infancy. I can say in terms of the microgenderdome that there are differences between the male and female microbiome in this collection of microbes in their DNA. We know that women tend to modulate estrogen levels differently than men, and much of that is governed by a certain set of bacteria. And what we're talking about here is an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. And so the idea with estrogen as the master regulator in the female body is that you want to produce it, you want to use it, and then you want to get rid of it. You don't want it recirculating in the body over and over again like bad karma. And if you have kind of the dysbiosis, the wrong balance of microbes in your gut, you're more likely to keep recycling it and for your estradiol levels to climb, to get too high. And just like any hormone, you want to have your estrogen levels in this Goldilocks place of not too high, not too low. So those are some of my initial thoughts. Let me let you riff.
No, I think it's great. There are various labs that will give you your beta-glucuronidase activity. I think Genova Diagnostics does that, and that's very valuable information. And I think that what you're getting at here are the various ratios and the subtypes of estrogen, which might sound complicated for our viewers, but maybe you can unpack what you mean by that.
Sure.
And also
yes.
touch upon some genetic issues that would have a bearing on those ratios.
Yeah, sorry for my Apple Watch ringing here. So, I think of estrogen as this entire family. And so we sometimes think of it as just one hormone, but actually it's a group of hormones. So if you look first at the one that we kind of know the best, it's estradiol. So estradiol is the form of estrogen that you make throughout your reproductive years as a woman. You start to make more of it when you go through puberty, and then you make it pretty consistently until about age 35, and that's when things start to get a little more confusing. And so after 35, somewhere around 70 to 80% of women start to fluctuate wildly in how much estradiol they're making. And progesterone changes as well. Estrogen and progesterone, estradiol and progesterone work together like tango partners. You want to have really good balance between the two so that one partner is not dominating. So estradiol is the main estrogen that you make throughout your reproductive life. And then estriol is another protective estrogen that you make primarily in pregnancy. And then there's a third estrogen. There's many others, but the third is estrone, or E1. One is part of the word. Estradiol is E2. Estriol is E3. That's one of the ways you can separate these three. Estrone is the one that you tend to make primarily after menopause. So it's more provocative, it's less protective, and all of these estrogens can then get metabolized by the body into either kind of the protective group that helps to reduce the risk of things like breast cancer, diabetes, endometrial cancer, and in men, prostate cancer, or they can go down the pathway of more dangerous and provocative estrogen metabolites that increase the risk of those particular conditions. And there's even a 4-quinone pathway that is especially genotoxic, so it can cause mutations and damage to DNA.
And how wonderful it is that functionally minded healthcare providers have the access to laboratory studies to absolutely delineate these pathways and their efficacy in women, to provide this information, and that you can influence these pathways based on taking certain supplements.
That's right. I mean, your food can change the pathway of these metabolites. Something as simple and humble as fiber can dramatically change kind of the balance of the protective estrogens versus the less protective. You know, fiber is sort of, I think, the unsung hero of our food. It's what we know, I think of it as a source of prebiotics. It's a way of feeding the good bugs in our gut. And it's, you know, it's sad to me to realize that on average, an American woman gets about 12 grams of fiber a day. 12 grams. That's not very much. Dr. Perlmutter, I imagine you eat much more fiber than that in a day. Do you know how much you get?
It's hard to say. I take a supplemental 10 grams of acacia fiber, which is pure prebiotic fiber. So that probably counts for a lot more if you consider what percentage of total fiber is prebiotic fiber. I would say I probably get at least 30 to 40 grams, if not more. It's been estimated that our Paleolithic ancestors may have gotten as much as 105 grams of fiber a day. And I totally am right in line with you that, you know, people talking about ratios of fat calories to carb calories as being the thing. And there's such a movement to be on a low-carb diet, and I agree with that, but I think the qualifier has to be refined carbs, not carbs. So people say, I went on a low-carb diet, nothing happened, I felt crappy. Well, that's because you eliminated the fiber, which is, by definition, a carbohydrate. So I broke my fast today with kale. That was the kale and sardines. It's what I've had today with a little olive oil. And but I'm right there. I totally agree with you. It's not going to be part of a diet if a diet is, you know, using processed foods and foods that are easy. I'm certainly sure you're aware of the study came out just 2 weeks ago, demonstrating that consumption of these ultra processed foods was associated with, in JAMA, was associated with a increased risk of all-cause mortality of 14%. So, you know, what we're talking about in our new book is reconnecting with food. And food doesn't come out of a box. Reconnecting with food, being grateful that we have food, that's what fasting helps us do, aside from all the other aspects of fasting. And reconnecting through food by virtue of the fact that we prepare it and then we share that with other people at mealtime, not with the news programs that happen to be on at the same time we're having dinner. So
this is so important. I want to just highlight the point that you just made about social genomics, because I think a lot of people don't put these together. They don't realize that the way that you eat your food, if you're with benevolent people, if you're hanging out with those women that we talked about earlier that tend to befriend you and you tend to befriend them, it creates this virtuous cycle in the body so that you're really able to absorb the nutrients that you're taking in. If, on the other hand, you're too busy, you're eating at your desk, I was horrified to read the statistic that 80% of Americans eat in their car. So not sitting in the parking lot at a mountain.
That explains the picture on your website. I didn't. There was on your website. There's a picture of a woman eating while she's driving. Which, right off the bat, we shouldn't be doing anything while we're driving. But there you go. Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah. So many people do this, and I just want to call out the problems here, because if you're, what happens with the way our DNA evolved is that if you have this perception of social isolation, social rejection, or social conflict, it triggers the immune system to prepare for physical injury, meaning that it ramps up and becomes inflamed even in the absence of any sort of physical injury actually occurring. And so that can happen based on your mental state. It can happen, if you're driving in a car, you're socially isolated, you have a high risk of injury, and it's just not the sort of response that we want, especially while eating food. So I just wanted to highlight kind of this piece of social genomics and how we want to be working with our body. We want to be working in a positive way with social genomics so that it's not working against us, which is what you're doing if you're eating in the car.
Well, it brings to mind the kind of unsung benefit of fasting, and that is, everybody's talking about the hormetic effect, gene activation, etc. Great. But what about the gratitude that you have food after your fast? That we live in a time when food is available, and it's only quite recently that that's been the case, that we haven't gone from meal to meal hoping there'd be one more to come. As hunter-gatherers, we weren't always successful in those endeavors. So it's the gratitude part that is this, the social genetics of it. What that, as you mentioned, what that does to us, which is good for us. It allows us to connect to the food, to the person who's sharing that meal, and to just connect with the overall feeling of gratitude, which gets to where we're going, is the more you do something, the more the brain becomes hardwired to be a conduit for that sort of, dare I say, mentality, or at least
agree.
View on the world.
Yeah,
But you mentioned, in our DNA, I want to shift gears just to this notion that a situation like Alzheimer's reflects the carrying of a gene that we know, in the case of Alzheimer's, the presenilin 1 gene, or the APOE4 allele. And there seems to be, a sense that, well, I have the gene, I'm basically in deep trouble, and there's nothing I can do. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Well, I think you know the numbers better in terms of gene versus environment, and how they interface with Alzheimer's than I do. But what I assessed was this huge paradigm shift. When I graduated from Harvard Medical School 25 years ago, we thought that genes were your destiny. And we were so excited about the Human Genome Project because we thought, okay, there'll be, one gene for height, one gene for blood sugar. We'll figure out how to work around it. We'll be done. And that's not the case at all. There's 6,000 genes for blood sugar. There's many genes involved in height. And when it comes to something like Alzheimer's disease, or if you look at chronic disease in general, only about 10 to 15% of your risk of chronic disease is related to your genes. The rest, which is what we have a fair amount of control over, the 85 to 90%, is your environment, much of which is determined by your lifestyle choices, how you architect your day. Now, I think the numbers might even be a little different with Alzheimer's. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think we're certainly quite aware that there are risk genes which are predisposition related as opposed to being determinants. For example, the APOE4 allele is associated with as much as a 5-fold increased risk without any other intervention for developing that condition. If you carry both, the risk is increased 12-fold. That's what the statistics tell us. And I'm not willing to accept that because it's very fatalistic and deterministic, and that's not reality. You mentioned in medical school, we were told genes determined outcome. That was, the dictum that we all abided by. Then there was other people who said, no, it's not our nature, it's our nurture. That's what's most important. And how we celebrate now that it's actually a beautiful dance between nature and nurture. That our lifestyle choices, be they good or bad, are influencing genetic expression every moment of our lives. That's hugely empowering because it challenges, front and center, this notion of genetic determinism, which has been abandoned. And in the context of Alzheimer's, then, if you are a carrier of the APOE4 allele, you have increased risk. We're talking 20 to 25% of Americans. Then what should you do? There are actions that you can take when you have an increased risk for any situation by virtue of a genetic predisposition, whether it's the CHEK2 gene or the APOE4 gene. There are things that you can intelligently do to reduce risk of those genes manifesting in a way that we don't want to see. And as it relates to Alzheimer's, that's what this documentary is all about, that you spoke about with such eloquence. And that is our lifestyle choices are hugely relevant in determining outcome, and that we can offset the risk imparted by carrying the APOE4 allele, for example. Some of the stuff I presented at the conference that you and I were attending showed that while there is a significant increased risk for accumulation of beta amyloid in your brain if you have the APOE4 allele, that risk is hugely increased carrying the amyloid in your brain if you are insulin resistant. Well, you can't change the fact that you carry the APOE4 allele, but you can certainly do your very best not to become insulin resistant. And if you are, lower your risk by the work of Sarah Hallberg. In fact, I'll tell our viewers, go to the interview that I did with Dr. Hallberg and see what you need to be doing. So we do find great value in knowing our genetic predispositions. I'm a great proponent of understanding your genome to determine what you as an individual need to pay attention to in terms of mitigating risk as could have been imparted by your genetic predisposition. I've learned that I have a huge issue with respect to my ability to methylate, and my viewers know what that means. We've talked about it. And as such, I have to take a special form of B vitamins that are methylated folate, methylated B12, etc. And I believe I've offset my risk. How do I know? There are markers, in my case, homocysteine being one of them, inflammatory markers as well, that are influenced by this genetic variance that makes me who I am. I'm sure there's an upside to it. There's got to be, or it wouldn't have persevered in our human genetics. So that said, it brings me back to the APOE4 allele, and it's been so persistent in the human genome globally. We have to, instead of castigating it always, ask what's its good side.
Yes.
Why would it have persevered in our in human genomics? And there are many people who speculated as to what carrying that gene might do in a good way. Dr. Bredesen, Dale Bredesen, has speculated that when we came down from trees, we're at more risk for infection by walking in the dirt and and injuring ourselves. That the APOE4 upregulates inflammatory response. Downside being cardiovascular disease risk, Alzheimer's risk. Upside being better immunity to take care of those infections. Which, if I'm going on too much, let me know. But it brings up an interesting thought.
No, this is great. This is great.
Of men and women's brains and risk for Alzheimer's. Women don't have the Y chromosome. They're XX. They have two X chromosomes, and as such, it's been hypothesized that they have increased inflammatory response, which might explain why women live longer than men. They have a more robust immune system, but the downside of unbridled inflammation, which is also affected by lifestyle choices, is increased risk for Alzheimer's and autoimmune conditions, which are 80% of which are found in women. With a few exceptions. So, not sure how we got to this discussion, but
no, this is super good.
It's supposed to be for you, but I'm enjoying our conversation.
Me too. I feel like there's a corollary that's worth mentioning in this conversation about genomics and, what if you are an APOE4 carrier. I have Alzheimer's disease in my family. So I have a maternal grandmother who died of Alzheimer's disease, and it had very early onset. And I do not have any of the Alzheimer's genes. But I can tell you from witnessing her experience, it's made me so motivated to realize that, okay, even if you don't have any of the genes that increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease, it's still on us to reduce the chance of being on that arc toward Alzheimer's disease. Controlling your blood sugar, as you mentioned. I get up every morning, I make my matcha tea, I continue my fast for 16 hours. I meditate because that's one of the most effective ways I've found for stress resilience. And then I exercise, because I think exercise is so important for my brain-body connection. And I think sometimes when I'm on my Peloton, or I'm at a spin class, or I'm running or walking my dog, I think sometimes about my grandmother, my beloved grandmother, who died of Alzheimer's disease. And I think about, yes, there are people who have an increased risk because they carry like the ApoE4 gene, but there's also the majority of people who have Alzheimer's disease who do not have this genetic link, or at least one that we understand at this point. And so I think it's really important for all of us, especially as we look at this epidemic in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease, to make sure that we're doing these lifestyle choices, that we're picking the right virtuous actions each day, so that we can reduce our risk of this disease.
And it's not like there's one anti-Alzheimer's program and there's another for reducing your risk of heart disease. They're all the same. They're all inflammatory. So doing what you do each day is reducing your risk of the number one cause of death on the planet, chronic degenerative conditions, which are inflammatory mechanistically. And yet your great-grandmother, you have to tell us about your great-grandmother.
Okay, you have such a good memory. So my grandmother, I mentioned,
picked you up at the bus stop.
She picked me up at the bus stop, and starting when I was 7 years old, she would get lost driving to her house. So this was in Maryland, and she happened to really love martinis. She had 2 to 3 of them every single night. She loved sugar. She would bake every day. She did not engage her mind the way that I know you like to and I like to. She watched soap operas most of the day. On the other hand, I grew up with a great-grandmother on my other side of the family who was a bit of a radical. So she believed in the power of whole foods. She felt like what you put on your plate, what you put on your fork, is more important to your health than anything you find in a pill bottle. She practiced yoga every day. She died in her sleep at 97, 0 chronic disease, still able to put her foot behind her head, which she often did at cocktail parties. And she outlived 4 husbands. She had a career. She was really engaged with life. She didn't drink because she felt like her liver just didn't metabolize it well. And so she used to say, I love wine, but wine doesn't love me. So she had this different model of aging. She had this architecture for her daily life that was very different than my beloved grandmother. And so as I grew up with these 2 models of aging, I decided I want what my great-grandmother had. And that's a big part. It's a huge influence of the kind of work that I do, the kind of books that I write, the way that I take care of patients, and certainly the way that I architect my day.
It's a powerful message. I think one thing that it's important to clarify for our viewers, and that is, if you don't have the Alzheimer's gene, that's not that doesn't open the door. As what you've just been saying, you still got to pay attention. You can get Alzheimer's, believe me, without the Alzheimer's gene. The genetic issues that I have, the MTHFR, for example, there are plenty of YouTube videos on this if you want to learn about it. MTHFR is a powerful risk for Alzheimer's, and the other subtle things that you may learn about yourself from doing a genomic panel, like issues with your vitamin D receptor, for example. There's not been a huge amount of data that has yet correlated that with Alzheimer's risk, but when we recognize how important this vitamin D is for the brain, that 90% of the vitamin D receptors are represented within the brain, where they actually do play a role in terms of energetics. I think we will soon see that these, what we call them polymorphisms, or variations on genes, are related, and therefore, what is the simple fix? Well, we try to flood those vitamin D receptors with higher levels of vitamin D so they do what they're supposed to do. We push a little harder in that direction because now we have good information. But I want to just really emphasize that all the things you're talking about, all the lifestyle changes in your book, go well beyond reducing risk for brain disease.
That's right. I mean, it's important to me that women especially feel empowered, that they feel fully realized, that they're not just breaking stereotypes and breaking glass ceilings, but that they have the energy to serve their mission. We know that purpose and mission is what pulls us toward a life well lived. And so it's not just the brain-body connection. It's really what the brain-body connection provides as a platform in terms of living your life.
Sara, what is the mission?
Well, I think we all have to determine what that mission is. It's one of the great spiritual questions that we each have. For me, my mission is to change the conversation about women and women's health. My mission is to educate clinicians, because you and I trained in the allopathic model. We have, I won't speak for you, but I have one foot in the allopathic world with all of my colleagues that I've gone through education with, but I also have one foot in what you could call the precision medicine or the personalized lifestyle medicine or functional medicine or integrative medicine world. And it's important to me to build bridges. So I feel like my mission is about building bridges. Ultimately, I think it's about repairing the world, however you determine your role in that. You know, it may be related to planetary health, it may be related to triple bottom line, it might be related to quantifying health. But let me turn this back on you. What's your mission?
Well, you know, the truth is that before we hit the record button, you indicated that you observed that I have an ability to take complex information and make it understandable by many people. And that's my mission. My mission is allowing people to hear the other side of the story, to give them the empowerment through knowledge to make better choices for better outcomes as it relates to mostly health, and really to take people away from a place of dependency on industry to solve their ills and recognize that they are the arbiters of their destiny. So I see that as my mission. As I told you, that's my skill set. And I told you I don't play ping pong very well, and I don't do well on the high dive. So, you know, in extending that to others, I think it's important to identify your skill sets. And when you find those, those are your gifts, and to exploit them for the common good. And just, you know, moving forward, that's, as we are writing this manuscript, became so clear that it's a bigger picture than just the individual. And, you know, now more than ever, when you look around, now more than ever, we got to pay attention to each other. We got to pay attention to Gaia and recognize that this has been an amazing ride for 2 million years, and we don't want that ride to be over. And we can make changes now. So
I love it. May I take the opportunity to reflect a couple of things back to you?
Sure.
So I love your mission. I love the synthesis that you do, because I think it's sacred, and it's also not done enough in the way that we talk about health. And so I think your synthesis is head and shoulders above other people who, you know, look at the literature and try to translate that into a message. I also think there's an additional piece that you do, which is action. So I think it's crucial to have the messaging, to have, you know, a really clear understanding about the brain and what we can do with our fork and with supplements and with movement. But in many ways, I think knowledge is just part of the equation. And I'm more and more humbled by this the longer that I'm in clinical practice, because I think change management is really the hard piece here. And so I feel that it's the synthesis and the messaging, but there's a third piece that you have a unique ability, a great gift toward, and that is translating that synthesis and that messaging into action. So I just wanted to reflect that back to you, because I think that's a really important piece here too.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. I do, and I appreciate your validation from you know, being validated from somebody who I so respect means a heck of a lot. So let's tell our, and I thank you for that. Let's tell our viewers that about your wonderful book, and when is this coming out? Soon, available everywhere, right?
That's right.
And for our viewers, I've been given permission from your publisher to put on my website the foreword that you asked me to write for your book.
Yay! Oh, that's so exciting.
So I think when people read that, that'll be insightful to move forward and read your amazing book. So I want to thank you for our time together today, and I want to thank you again for your participation last week. And I want to thank you for everything you do. You need to know, from an outsider, looking in, that you're doing just amazing stuff, and I just so honor your dedication.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for all the work that you do. I just feel like, often we're taught in our training about these egoic ways of sharing knowledge, and I feel like the work that we do is much more about how we're stronger together, and that collaboration is the way that we all shine, and we all feel better and live longer, prevent the risk of Alzheimer's disease, reduce the inflammation in our bodies, and really execute on our mission. So thank you for all of your work too.
Okay, well, we'll talk soon.
Great.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
What an inspiring individual. What an incredible body of work she has created and participates in on a daily basis, really empowering women to be their very, very best selves by leveraging what we understand now in terms of our lifestyle choices and their impact on health and participation in life. Thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. We will be back soon. Bye for now.